New worries on Wall Street right now. Rattled investors take stock of a stark new warning from the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Jerome Powell says President Trump's unpredictable economic policies could inflict lasting damage on your wallet. This morning, the president fires right back on Truth Social, saying, and I'm quoting him now, "Too late." Jerome Powell of the Fed, who is always too late and wrong, yesterday issued a report which was another and typical complete mess. The president continued, Powell's termination cannot come fast enough, end quote. Powell's term is not due to end for another year. I want to go live right now to CNN White House reporter Elena Treen. Elena, is there any reason to believe that President Trump will try to force Powell out before the end of his term?
He could certainly try, Wolf, and we know that in the past, the president has, on several occasions, threatened to remove Powell from his post. Remember, the Federal Reserve operates independently from the White House, and so if President Donald Trump were even to try to do that, it would likely face a lot of legal issues in court. But this is something actually that Jerome Powell, while issuing that very stark warning yesterday about the economic situation in this country, noting specifically because of President Donald Trump's tariff policies, he reiterated that the Fed is independent from the White House and also said it's a matter of law. Listen to how he put it.
We're never going to be influenced by any political pressure. People can say whatever they want. That's fine. That's not a problem. But we will do what we do strictly without consideration of political or any other extraneous factors.
Now, part of that comes, of course, as well after the president on several occasions, including multiple times during this administration, but also over the past few years and back into his first administration, had called on the Fed to lower interest rates, to cut interest rates. And that's exactly what he did this morning, pointing to how the European Central Bank was doing that as well. But as you could hear there from Jerome Powell, he said that they will not be making decisions based off what President Donald Trump or other politicians are saying. Also of note, of course, is that Jerome Powell's term is not set to end until May of next year. So this is going to likely be a continued contentious relationship between President Trump and the Federal Reserve Chair. Wolf.
All right, Elena Treen at the White House for us. Thank you very much.
Richard, let's turn to the president. At this point, we've become quite familiar with his criticism and views of Jay Powell, Fed chair, who he appointed in his first term and then later on went to regret. We should remind viewers that during his first term, at one point, he even called him a bigger threat to the United States than President Xi of China. Now, all of that being said, we know that he has no legal right to fire Fed Chair Powell, and this comes at a time when there is already so much uncertainty from international investors and countries about the stability of the United States. Just give us more on that aspect, and not as much focused on whether or not he can or will fire him, because he can't.
Okay, there are two phrases that are hallmarks of probity and integrity when it comes to the Fed or it comes to economic policy. The first that Treasury secretaries and presidents always say is a strong dollar is in the best interests of the United States. Any deviation from that phrase is dynamite. The second, the Fed is independent and will do what it sees it's fit for the economy, and I have total confidence in the Fed, or some version thereof. Any deviance from that, dynamite. And that's what President Trump is playing with, because even though he can't fire him, the mere thought that you're going to make trouble for the Fed, you're going to put political pressure, you're going to undermine its credibility. Who might he appoint as vice? If a chair comes up, who's he going to pressure? It's very damaging. The only line that governments or presidents are supposed to say is the Fed is independent and will do what it sees fit. Any of this nonsense about the termination, the this, the that, the other, it's undercutting the Fed's independence credibility.
And Richard, just in terms of what Jerome Powell said at the Economic Club of Chicago yesterday, I mean, he really underscored that he was sort of taken aback and a bit surprised by the sheer magnitude of these tariffs, and really said in very plain terms that the U.S. economy was essentially going to suffer if these tariffs went into effect. He really outlined that, and that is one of the reasons why the markets were down yesterday. Just give us your take on what he said there.
The word significantly higher tariffs, we'd heard that a couple of weeks ago, but the different bit was this mention of the dual mandate, full employment and price stability, being in tension with each other, as the Fed chair put it. And he gave us a roadmap. He said, if there comes a choice, which do we deal with? The full employment or the price stability? We deal with the most urgent. We deal with the one that is most pressing. And in this case, it would have probably be the higher inflation. But what that means, higher inflation, by the way, would mean keeping interest rates higher. So that would suggest that the Fed is preparing itself for some form of stagflation, where growth slows to almost nothing, inflation remains high, unemployment starts to rise, and they're only powered to do one versus the other, which would be dealing with inflation.
President Trump threatening the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell with termination, just one day after Powell warned that Trump's trade war could have truly devastating consequences for the U.S. economy. Let's discuss this and more with Democratic Congresswoman Shelley Pingree of Maine. Congresswoman, thanks so much for joining us. If the president actually fires Powell, what could that do to the central bank's independence?
Look, there is already so much financial turmoil going on, whether it's the stock market or the bond market. I think this would cause an incredible upset, just as his tariffs have caused in my state and across the country.
The chairman, Powell, warned the president's trade policy could lead to higher inflation and slower growth if tariffs remain in effect. How are businesses in your district bracing for that possibility? And you're in Maine. And do you see a global recession as a likely outcome as well?
Well, we're certainly hearing more people talk about a global recession. And just bringing it back to my state of Maine, you know, we're surrounded by 3 different Canadian provinces. So we have great concerns above and beyond what's going on in many other states. But I've heard from so many business people that they don't know how their supply chain is going to go. They're worried about their own exports. You know, we have some very specific industries, wild blueberries, lobsters, softwood lumber, that are extremely dependent on our trade with Canada, but also there is some impact with China. We also have shipbuilding, so steel and aluminum. You know, there are just so many things to take into consideration. And people didn't expect this out of the president. Maybe he talked about tariffs, but they thought it would be a more sensible move. They thought it was to bring back manufacturing and it would be done in a systemic way. This is so chaotic. Nobody knows what to predict. And in terms of our Canadian neighbors, they're just mad at us all the time.
As you know, Congresswoman, many of your fellow Democrats have been criticized for not having a unified position on Trump's trade war. For example, your fellow Maine Democrat Congressman Jared Golden has largely been supportive of these various tariffs. Does your party need a more coherent message?
Look, trade is complicated and tariffs are complicated. And one of the reasons my colleague feels that way is because Maine is one of those states that was really damaged by NAFTA. We lost a lot of our manufacturing, and there are still people who are hoping that tariffs will bring back manufacturing. And I fully understand that. It's just the way the president is going about doing it that is so chaotic, that doesn't make an investment in manufacturing and doesn't think about all the other things that we're concerned about raw materials, about labor markets. You know, there's a lot that has to go on to make sure you can have stable manufacturing in our state. So the idea that we would have a coherent message or there's just one way to go about doing this, that's just not true. I would say most Democrats are opposed to the tariffs, but you're not going to get 100% on anything. And there are some arguments about why tariffs could be useful if they were used well.
Good point. Congresswoman Shelley Pingree of Maine, thanks so much for joining us.